What's up everybody? Hey, it's me, Shawn Astrom, and today I have a pretty cool tutorial. I had a comment about how to use the volumetric fog feature inside of Corona. We're going to take a look at that. I'm also going to show you how we can use displacement to build a landscape, the terrain mask shader, and also the reference shader, which is a plugin. Let's take a look. Hey guys, so here we are in good old Cinema 4D. I'm going to bring in a plane object. I'm going to bring in a cube. I'm going to make this cube nice and tall. And why not a little taller? I'm going to bring in a cloner. We're going to throw that guy into there. And let's do a grid array. Let's do 5 in the X and Z directions. And let's just space these guys out. So we're getting a bunch of pillars here. Then I'm also going to bring in a random effector, and let's just randomize the position and the scale a little bit of these guys, just so we're getting sort of this cityscape, or whatever you want to call it, pillars and whatnot. Because what I want to show you guys is how we can use the volumetric fog effect inside of Corona Renderer. So if I go into my Corona render settings here, I already have Corona set up here, and I've changed a couple things. I've set the max passes for the interactive rendering to 25, and then that's pretty much it. I've also set my resolution to 896 by 504, and that's just so you guys can get a nice preview here. And if you see, we're gonna let this load up here. We have a dark blank scene because there is no light, so we have to add in a sky and a sun. And now we're overexposed, so we're going to add in a camera. Let's add in a Corona camera tag, and let's just lower the exposure. Now if I refresh this, it should pick up those exposure settings, so there we go. That's looking nice. And that's pretty much what I wanted to set up quickly for you guys, just to show how this works. It's really important that you have the correct geometry or something that's actually going to work that will allow you to see this God ray effect or volumetric fog effect. If you don't have the scene set up properly, then it's going to be really hard to visualize this effect. So going over here to my Corona materials, I'm going to add a Corona volume, and let's name this fog. And let's go ahead under scattering here and just add a bit of color here. So we got a couple gray values here. And you're probably wondering, well, where do we put this material? And you actually put it inside of the scene environment render settings here. So if we just check global volume and then I throw this volume material right in here, we link it up rather, then we now have this fog effect applied. Now you might also be wondering now, well, I didn't see anything happen, and that is because under the material here we have this distance value, and this needs to be increased to a value that's appropriate for the scene. So I'm going to start off with a value of 500, and you'll notice we have a very dark scene. Now I might try and compensate a little bit with this by going to the exposure here and raising this up to a more reasonable value, but you can start to see here that we're starting to see some fog. Now another very important setting that we want to enable when we're doing this sort of volumetric effect for the total environment is we want to enable the single bounce only option inside of the material, and that's going to really greatly speed up the render time. And also for a big atmospheric fog like this, we don't really need multiple scattering going on for this effect. So moving along here, I'm going to crank up my exposure a little bit more. I don't want to go too high because then it would kind of be unrealistic, and this is kind of what I'm going for. Now you'll notice that we don't really have those rays yet that you might be looking for, and a couple reasons for that. Well, I'm going to lower the sun angle so we have a little better angle on our sun. See where that guy is in our scene. I'm also going to do kind of a wide angle lens on the camera, and you can kind of see how the fog is being occluded right there by the pillar here, and you can kind of see these rays starting to happen. But if we go into the fog setting here, the volumetric volume setting here, there's this directionality, very important for getting this effect. If I crank this up to a value of around 6, I have found works really well. You'll now see that we're getting those awesome God rays, or very apparent light scattering rays that we would get from the sun casting onto trees or buildings or what have you. And it's pretty much as simple as that. You know, you want to also make sure that these values here are not too crazy. I have noticed that if you crank up this value under absorption all the way to 100%, that not only does it, you know, get crazy bright, but the volume no longer works. So we want to make sure that keep these values down to a reasonable level. So we don't want to have over bright colors here. Same with the scattering, we want to keep those reasonable. Now you can actually add in some color here with scattering and also with the absorption. And let me lower the exposure down a little bit and we can see what we got here. And it's an awesome effect. You can really get some nice looks with this. And so I quickly wanted to show you guys how to properly set up that with some very simple geometry in the scene so that you can see how that's done before we get too carried away with any sort of crazy scene. And just by changing that, you can see that how much that affected the fog. And this is looking pretty good. I'm going to go back to the kind of 50% value here, and then kind of a 60% value here, and then I'm going to crank up that exposure a little bit more. Now, of course, the distance setting also, we really have to keep this into consideration. This is sort of like the density of the volume. You could think of it like that. But I think for the sake of this demo, yeah, that's looking pretty good. So moving along here, I wanted to show you guys, I'm going to stop the IR, the interactive renderer there. I wanted to show you how we can do some procedural mountains or a procedural landscape. So I'm actually going to get rid of my sun and my sky. I'm going to get rid of this stuff. I'm going to leave the plane, and we're going to call this land. And actually, if I open up my picture viewer here, I got some. This is an image that I did right before I started recording this tutorial for you guys, and this kind of didn't take me long to set this up at all. And I'm going to show you guys how we can do a similar scene here. So yeah, I was doing some testing earlier. I'm going to get rid of these guys. So we're going to try and get something that looks like this real quickly here. So if I go to my plane here, I want to make sure to add in lots of geometry. Not too crazy, but something like 512 by 512. You can see kind of the amount of detail we got there. I'm going to hide my grid. And we actually want to do two of these. I'm going to do one for the render and one for the viewport. And this is a pretty cool little technique for setting up landscapes. So I'm going to go ahead and create a new Corona material. We'll call this land as well. And I'm going to throw this guy onto my render layer. And I'm going to enable this at render time, and let's hide it in the viewport. And I'm going to do the opposite here and disable this guy at render time. Now we're going to bring in a good old displacer deformer. We're going to place that as a child of the viewport plane here. Now if I select my material and I go to displacement, and I'm going to pop in a wonderful noise shader. That's one of the beautiful things with Corona for Cinema 4D is it fully supports all of Cinema 4D's native shaders parametrically and procedurally and without having to bake out a ton of textures, and so that is really an awesome feature with Corona. So I'm going to set the global scale. I set this to wavy turbulence, change the seed. I cranked up the octaves here, and the global scale I'm going to set to something like 2500. And we'll see what we get here in a minute, because I'm going to put this same texture, or instance rather, this noise into this displacer. Now the way I'm going to do that, unfortunately, has to be done using a plugin. Now if you look over here, this website blackstar-solutions.de, they make this wonderful plugin called the reference shader. It's kind of an old plugin, but it works wonderfully with R19, and it also works with Corona. I've shown this off in a couple other of my videos, but this essentially gives us nodal compatibility or nodal functionality with Cinema's default layer-based shading system. So if I go inside here and I go into my displacer, under the shading tab I want to throw in a reference shader. Now the reference shader I just need to select by going to this Tools tab here. I need to select out of my land material, I need to select that noise. And just like that, you'll see we're getting some nice visual representation of that shader right inside the viewport here by applying this displacer to this separate plane geometry. So the last thing I want to do here, well, a couple other things. The displacer setting, I want to make sure that this is set to intensity and not intensity centered. And that's going to mimic what Corona is going to do with this max level value here. So another little cool thing I can do is I'm going to right click here and go expression set driver. I'm going to go to my displacer and set this height expression set driven. And now if we just adjust the max level here, I'm going to set this to 200, you'll see that we're getting a nice representation of what we will see at render time with the displacement. And that's a really cool way for getting quick feedback in the viewport, and then we're going to get some beautiful displacement at render time here in a second. So I'm going to bring in a sky, name it HDRI. I'm going to create a new light material, and if I go here under the emission tab, I'm going to load in a texture. I got my little tutorial folder here. I got a couple prepared. These are out of my CG HDRI Sky Kit, the latest of a couple that I have. But I'm going to start out with this Clouds Building HDRI. And if you guys haven't checked those out, definitely go to my website, shawnastrom.com/CG HDRI, or you can just select the link over here. I officially have these two guys here. This was the first one I did about 3 years ago. This one's only a year old. There's 50 HDRIs in here, guys, if you haven't checked them out. Pretty cool stuff, but I'm going to use one of those in here. And all we got to do is throw that onto my sky object there. And let's widen up our camera angle even more to like a 15 millimeter. And yeah, so this is what we're getting in the viewport. And I'm going to fire up the IPR and we'll see what we're getting in here. Now keep in mind we still have the volumetric fog effect going on. And we also are a little underexposed because that HDR is a little less bright by about 5 stops than the default Corona sky and sun. So as I start to crank up the exposure here on my camera, you'll see we're getting a pretty awesome looking landscape. Now, Corona has really amazing displacement, but one thing I want you to notice is if you look here at my interactive rendering window, you'll notice that some of the geometry is not displaced and other parts of it are. And that is because if we go into the performance settings here under displacement here, the Corona displacement is based upon your screen size resolution, and this is really powerful because it's an adaptive way of calculating the displacement. And so if I refresh the IPR window right now, or the IR, you'll see now that we should be getting displacement all over the place based on that new camera angle. So if I whip the camera over here, then you will see that this stuff has not been displaced until I refresh my IR. then we should get the proper displacement. So pretty powerful. You can see how fast it calculates. It doesn't have to bake out any textures. And this is looking pretty darn cool. I'm going to spin the camera around a little bit here, get a little nice angle there. Oops, that was too far. Let's scoot forward a bit here. Now I want to try and get this volumetric fog looking a little nicer. I'm going to try and crank up the directionality a bit. And then the distance value, I'm going to lower. See if we can't get that to have a little bit more of an impact, because it's essentially denser now. And I'm going to crank up that exposure. And I'm not doing real world values here, but I think you kind of get the idea. So yeah, we can kind of see how that fog's working. I think if I brighten this up a little bit, we might get a little better results. And I've really found that you really just have to really play with the fog settings to kind of get the look that you might be going for. Now if I hop into my land material and crank up this max level so we get a little taller mountains, that might help a little bit. See if we can't get some of that God ray stuff going on. And this is always fun. I just love to get in here and start moving cameras around and trying to find cool angles. But one of the really fun things about a workflow like this is I can just hop into the noise here and change the seed value. And once we refresh our interactive renderer, we will see the updated scene here. And that's looking pretty cool. So another thing I can do to add in even some more detail is I can hop into my displacement shader here, and I'm going to throw this into a layer, and I'm going to apply a second noise. Let's throw Luca on here. It's always a good one for random noise, and let's crank this up to like 1500. And I'm going to set this to multiply, and let's get a pretty low value here. So it's going to be like a secondary level of noise. And if we just refresh here, we should get a nice little update. Now, inside our displacer here, we're no longer referencing the correct shader. So if we want to select this and now just tell it to reference the layer, see how that dropped down? Now we're getting a more accurate representation of what's going on there. So again, I want to play with my fog some more, really see if I can't get a nice dense fog going on here. And let's compensate with that exposure again. And I really think these values need to be played with a little bit. I'm going to try and brighten up the scattering a little bit. That seems to be helping. And maybe just brighten up the absorption. Whoa, but it's, again, you got to be real careful with that. It's a very subtle effect there. And actually, you know what, I'm going to leave it at 50, and then let's go back to the camera. Sorry guys, here just bouncing around, but this is how this stuff works. A lot of trial and error. And yeah, I think that's looking pretty cool. I could play with this stuff all day long to really dial it in, and that's really what you have to do with any of this fun CG art. But yeah, that's looking pretty cool. So next thing I want to show you guys is how can we increase the displacement detail. So we can do that by getting into the render settings here and actually lowering this value. So if I lower this to 1, now it's going to be 1 pixel. So I'm not sure mathematically how that ends up being calculated. But if I refresh here, you'll see that we're getting a lot more detail in the displacement. And there we go. So super quick to calculate. And yeah, if we were to lower that value even further, we'd get even more and more detail. But I think that looks pretty dang cool. So last thing I wanted to show you guys is how Corona supports. If I go to the Diffuse Channel here, I'm going to bring in oh no, it's hiding here. No worries. So I'm going to go in here and bring in the terrain mask shader. And if I fire up the IPR here, you should be able to see what we're getting there. And just like that, we kind of have some snow. And for those of you that might not have used the terrain mask shader, it's an amazing shader. And you can read all about it here in the help. Another quick tip, if you guys, any object or any selected element inside of Cinema, if you hit the Control F1 key, that will bring up the help, and you can learn all about the terrain mask shader right inside of Cinema here. Cinema's amazing built-in manual that so many other programs don't have. But yeah, so we have some snow. It looks kind of like snow. I'm going to actually lower the slope value here, slope angle rather, and then this is how we can kind of blur the edging. And then just to do something quick here, I'll just set this to add, throw in a little color here for our mountain. I think that looks pretty decent. And then if I go over here to the reflection channel, again I can use my magical reference shader. So I'm going to go reference shader, and I'm going to select that terrain mask. And now I put this in the glossiness slot, so just to verify what we're getting there, I'm going to crank up the IOR to a ridiculous number, and you can kind of see how we're getting. Now we have metallic snow, but I'm going to put that back to a more reasonable value. And so now we're just getting reflection on that snow a little bit. And yeah, I'm going to see if I can't get a nice final angle here, guys. And I just wanted to show you a few techniques, different ways we can use this volumetric fog, and also the wonderful power of Corona inside of Cinema 4D. And I think if I crank up my displacement to a slightly higher value, get some slightly taller mountains, that's looking pretty cool. Yeah, guys, I think this looks great. So I'm going to stop this, and let's increase our resolution a little bit. And under performance settings, I'm going to get crazy here and set the displacement to 0.5. Now, I wouldn't recommend that if you're doing like a 4K resolution render. I'd set that to 1 because it does fill up memory pretty quick, because it's just increasing the displacement quite a bit there. But let's fire up the viewport render here and see what we get. Calculating displacement. Should go pretty quick here. One thing I did not enable is the denoising feature inside of the render settings, but I'm not going to worry about that. But normally I would probably enable that denoising, especially when we're using the volumetric fog like that, because it could really help minimize just a little bit of noise we might get in our renders. And it looks like our displacement went a little crazy there. We're getting something slightly different than what we had in the IPR, but the IPR might not have been fully refreshed. But yeah, you guys can kind of see what we're getting there, and I'm going to double check that here because I'm curious now, and why not? So I'm going to enable the full denoising on this here, and let's fire up the IPR as well just to see really what we're getting there. And yeah, I guess if I look at, oh no, I got to crash. This does happen sometimes, guys. So, and that is because, well, Corona is still in beta. But just so you guys can see, I'll just restart and we'll get that fixed up. But yeah, I mean, I have every other engine that I use crashes on occasion. So we've all been there. But okay, here we are. Didn't take too long to fire that back up. So I think this is probably going to be a nicer angle. There we go. Got my denoising. And let's fire up the render again. So we'll just let this finish, and hopefully you guys can see a nice, lovely little render there. And yeah, guys, please make sure to head on over to ShawnAstrom.com to check out these skies. They're really cool. So with this pack, you get 50 of them. My old pack, the version 1.0, there's 36. There's actually 12 sets of 3. They're kind of variations on with the same sun angle and all that jazz. And then absolutely check out the reference shader. I use it all the time inside of Cinema's native, standard renderer. If I have a client that requires me to use standard or physical renderer, this is such a powerful plugin. I use it all the time. Look at that. There we go. So, not the most realistic spiky mountains here, but overall the lighting is looking pretty cool. I think this looks pretty dang neat for spending about 15 minutes on it. Obviously, with a little more finesse and attention to detail, we get a pretty awesome looking render here. Can't help myself but to go into the post-processing here, and let's just throw on a LUT, good old Canon LUT there, and here we can lower that exposure. Don't want to go too crazy, and then let's do a little filmic highlight, bloom and glare. And yeah, guys, this is just too much fun to play around with. And I'm going to see highlight compression. Let's cool down the image a little bit, crank up the contrast, and yeah, guys, this is looking pretty cool. Now the exposure's not letting me go over 20, and I think that might be a slight little bug with what we got going on here. I'm going to try and crank it up here and see if it will update. Let's see here. Oops, wrong window there. Oh yeah, so no, that is linked up correctly. So that just might be something that needs to be adjusted there. Let's try 21.5. Yeah, guys, cool. Sorry, I could just play with this all day long. It's a ton of fun. Post-process. Let's add some sharpening and a little more bloom and glare. Let's increase that sun glint, because why not? And if I stop the render here now, it only went for about a little under 3 minutes, but with the denoising, we're getting beautiful image. Yeah, guys, I think that kind of is going to wrap this up. And yeah, all the LUTs, the built-in LUTs, guys, can't beat those. So yeah, guys, sorry this one went on a little longer than normal, but kind of a lot of features that I wanted to show you. So I hope you enjoyed this, and we will see you again soon. Thanks for watching, guys.
Brograph.com, an online resource for learning Cinema 4D, After Effects, and other motion graphics tools specifically catered to help you prevail as a motion graphic designer.
What's up, bros? Welcome to another Brograph motion graphics tutorial.
With tutorials, plugins, and now a podcast with tens of thousands of listeners worldwide.
Yeah, it's a great community to be part of.
We give you professional time-saving tips, industry news, interviews, shortcuts, and lessons that help keep you current in the world of motion design.
Throw in the HDR studio, take the render settings, pick the HDR, put in reflection, and gorgeous.
I love projects that scare me. When our art director comes to us and asks for something that I had never done before, man, it gets me pumped.
Our weekly long-form podcast will give you the latest news, help you in your file management, hardware configuration, and client relations. Learn about the latest render engines, modeling techniques, and workflow integration while staying entertained.
Real nice banana.
Ah, that's so funny. All right. I'm going to live forever.
Our Brograph talks are a chance to see the way industry leaders from around the globe are changing the face of motion design.
Sometimes you got to make stuff that you're not going to put on your reel, and I'm not here to judge.
The podcasts and talks include people like Beeple, Barton Damer, Nick Campbell, Andrew Kramer, David Ariev, Chad Ashley, Paul Babb, EJ Hassenfrost, Mitch Myers, Chris Schmidt, Jules Urbach, Cornelius Dammert, David Brodeur, Andy Needham, Caitlin Kaju, Zubair Parker, Noseman, Ryan Bean, Casey Hupke, Nick Lyons, Sage, Joey Korenman, Jeremy Cox, Rick Barrett, John Dickinson, Matthias Omatola, Patrick Goski, Brandon Clements, Steve Teeple, Tom Glimpse, Patrick Longstream, Julia Simone, Devin Coe, Al Heck, and even Deadmau5.
You get that render done. Yeah, you better frame what?
Our Brograph breakdowns go behind the projects and give you an insight on what it's like to manage and maintain your own personal business or work for a large company. Join us for live sessions, check out our useful plugins, watch time-lapse projects, interact with us, and send us email questions and topic ideas. Or just hit the Rando Render button and do an imaginative daily that'll keep you on your toes.
Take all your dreams and let's do it!
Subscribe today and get automatic updates on the latest tutorials, tricks, tips, and inspiration brought to you by industry professionals Dave Koss and Matt Milstead.
We don't care how you get here, folks. Just get here.
Subscribe now to Brograph Tutorials.
It's pretty good, I guess.